Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Winecast. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and the topic for this Winecast builds off the earlier cast on the European Union wine classification framework and looks specifically at how Italy classifies its wines within that framework. So if you haven't already had a look at the EU classification Winecast, this might be a good time to have a gander at it. I wanted to talk about Italy because it's a major wine producer, and understanding its classification system will go a long way toward helping you make the best decisions for yourself when spending your wine dollar on Italian wine. But also, in the near future, I want to talk about the Super Tuscan movement from Italy, and making sense of that requires some knowledge about how wine classification works in the country overall. So let's just dive in. Though Italy currently conforms to the broad three-tiered structure for wine classification used by the EU, along with some local tweaks, Italy originally started out with only a two-tiered system that distinguished between quality wines and table wines that were renowned more for their ability to inebriate than for inspiring connoisseurship. The system was officially rolled out in 1963, and from the get-go, the quality wine tier was already divided into two sub-levels: Denominazione d'origine controllata, or controlled denomination of origin, and Denominazione d'origine controllata e garantita, controlled and guaranteed denomination of origin. The major difference between the two tiers being that at the DOCG level, wine produced is not only strictly regulated and controlled, like at the DOC level, but it's also guaranteed to be a wine of quality because it's undergone a sensory evaluation by a flesh and blood government functionary before being bottled. That's the theory anyway. These wines also bear an official numbered seal, indicating that they've been through this process. Like the EU PDO category that they would later help to inspire, the DOC-DOCG system was based on defining specific geographic areas and then pretty strictly regulating what and how wines can be produced in those areas to receive those designations. Though both of these sublevels of the quality wine tier were established in 1963, no DOCGs were awarded then, and the idea was that DOCs would progress to the next level over time. That finally happened in 1980 when the first two DOCG designations were given to Brunello di Montalcino in Tuscany, and then right afterwards to Barolo in the Piedmont. Those two awards opened the floodgates, and as of mid-2016, there are 74 DOCGs and a whopping 332 DOCs in Italy. At the other end of the classification was the table wine, or vino da tavola, category, and it was conceived as pretty much the opposite of the quality wine tier. The grapes for the wine could be sourced from anywhere in Italy, and wine could even be brought in from outside of Italy in bulk and then blended and bottled. Apart from basic health and safety provisions, there was very little regulation of this tier, and the expectation was that only low-quality, inexpensive wines would be produced here. Whatever the merits of the two-tiered system were, the biggest criticism that it came under, especially from Italian winemakers who were trying to produce quality wines, was its assumption that a specific set of very detailed regulations was the only road to quality. And by the early 1970s, a lot of these producers had had enough and were looking for alternate paths to quality than the DOCG regs for their area. Though things were happening all over Italy, ground zero for this movement was in Tuscany. The strict DOCG regs in Tuscany and throughout Italy often put quality wine producers in a bind. Most DOCs had rules regulating which grapes could and couldn't be used to produce wine, and these rules usually barred the use of so-called international varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. Also, some winemakers were required to use certain grapes of debatable quality in their wines. For instance, the original DOC regulations for Chianti wine in Tuscany required that at least 10% of the wine be made from the white grapes Malvasia or Trebbiano, even though the general consensus was that these grapes weren't doing anything for Chianti except reinforcing its image as a cheap wine in a funny wicker basket. Also, though Sangiovese is the dominant grape used in Chianti, winemakers weren't allowed to release a Chianti DOC wine that was 100% Sangiovese, no matter how good they might have thought their Sangio was that year. Things took a turn in 1971 when an important producer in Tuscany, the Marchese Mario Incisa della Rocchetta, released the 1968 vintage of a wine that he'd been making for some time, but only for personal and family consumption and not for commercial release. The wine was called Sassicaia and was a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc that the Marchese had been growing since the mid-1940s. But since Cab Sauv and Cab Franc weren't permitted by the DOC regulations where the Marchese was making wine, Sassicaia was declassified to table wine status. That might have been the end of it, except that by almost all accounts, Sassicaia was a great wine. Critics gushed about it and embraced it, with one particularly famous critic writing punnily that Sassicaia wasn't a vino da tavola, or a table wine, but a vino da favola, or a fable wine. Not long after this, other Tuscan producers, particularly from the Chianti zone, began releasing wines that bucked additional DOC regulations, variously omitting the use of white grapes, adding international varieties like Cab Sauv and Merlot, and making Chiantis that were 100% Sangiovese. These wines were getting lots of positive critical attention and commanding very high prices, and soon became known collectively as Super Tuscans because of this reputation for quality, despite getting there by taking the road less regulated. We'll talk more about the Super Tuscan movement and its legacy in the next Winecast, but for now the takeaway is that as more and more wines like this were produced both in Tuscany and throughout Italy, Italian wine authorities found themselves in a dilemma. Wines that were increasingly commanding international respect and acclaim were being classified as bottom-tier wines. The solution to this dilemma came in 1992 with the creation of a new category, the Indicazione Geografica Tipica, or typical geographic indication, placed between the quality wine and table wine tiers on the classification scheme. The resulting wine scheme was a compromise because it recognized the primacy of the DOC-DOCG classifications for delivering quality, but also allowed a venue for winemakers to experiment with alternate means to quality production without having to have their wines identified with bottom-shelf plonk. These IGT zones were one of the precursors to the PGI category that the European Union would adopt when it moved toward a three-tiered framework for its member countries, and like parallel zones in other countries, these areas overlap quality wine areas in the same region, are usually a bit larger than the local quality wine regions, and the regulations for wine production in them are quite a bit less strict. As of mid-2016, there are 119 IGTs in Italy. But not all wine regions have them. In two regions, namely the Val d'Aosta and the Piedmont, the royal road to quality is the DOC and only the DOC. So all wines in those two regions are either classified as DOC, DOCG, or just wine or varietal wine, which is the new designation for the Vino da Tavola tier. The attitude that the Val d'Aosta and Piedmont have toward IGT wines may seem to be behind the times when compared to Italy's 18 other regions that all have at least one IGT zone. But it's worth noting that not all producers who avail themselves of this tier are doing so with an eye to producing the next great Italian wine, and there's a lot of middling and middling to low quality wine being produced at this level. All of this has left Italy with a classification scheme that looks like this. There are likely to be some changes in the names of the categories as Italy and other EU member countries increase their conformity to EU norms for nomenclature, but the basic structure doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon. Well, that's it for now. Thanks again for joining me, and look for another Winecast specifically on the Super Tuscan movement and its impact that I hope this Winecast will make a little bit easier to follow. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this cast, and feel free to leave a comment below. I'm the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. As always, enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.